Today we are going to discuss the everyday challenges that immigrants faced in the early 1900s. One major challenge that immigrants faced was this idea of nativism. Nativism is the belief that those born in a country, the natives, are superior or better than immigrants. When people came to America from all over the world, they were not exactly greeted with open arms. The people in America were not always very friendly because they were intimidated by the new languages, the new culture, clothing, different food, different music, and all the different tastes of new immigrants. So this feeling of nativism began to develop. This cartoon here was published in the 1880s in newspapers around the country, and it was called Looking Backwards. It pretty much shows the irony, or how strange this idea of nativism was. If you look here, there's an immigrant getting off of the docks out of Ellis Island, about to enter America, only to be greeted by these rich and powerful men whose body language is obviously telling them that they are unwelcomed. It's as if his hands are telling him, stop, go back. If you look in the background of this photograph, these shadows here look nothing like the men that are in front of them. Instead, those shadows represent their ancestors, their grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. And it shows that their ancestors had once been immigrants too. So you can see their shadows went from rags to riches. Now these men consider themselves natives to America. Because of these anti-immigrant feelings, the government passed a law in 1882 that prohibited or kept Chinese immigrants from entering the United States. This law was only meant to be temporary. However, after each decade, the government continued to extend how long the Chinese would be excluded or not allowed to participate in entering the United States. It was created as a result of nativism or anti-immigrant feelings. It seems very confusing to us because we have grown up in a diverse society. It's surprising to hear that the government ever would target a group and say that they are not welcome in our country. The reason why the Chinese Exclusion Act took place is because the Chinese were very hard workers and they were willing to work for low pay, low wages. Because of this, American workers felt threatened and did not want their competition in the job market. Here's another political cartoon that shows the Chinese Exclusion Act. This had been published in newspapers as well. And as you can tell, it appears as if the gates of liberty, meaning the gates of freedom, and we know that the Statue of Liberty was what symbolized freedom and their entrance to America. The gates are closed to the Chinese immigrants. And it says that from the words of an enlightened American statesman, which is like a leader or a government official. It says, we must draw the line somewhere, you know? This cartoon is another great example of nativism. So with the law beginning in 1882 and the government continuing to extend the law every 10 years, the Chinese Exclusion Act was in effect for a total of 61 years. So for 61 years of American history, the Chinese were not allowed to enter the United States. There were very few ways around this law. If a Chinese person wanted to immigrate, they would have to show proof that they had had family that was already living here. They would have to pass rigorous tests at Angel Island. This policy came to an end when the Chinese became an ally or a supporter of the United States during World War II. So as a result of their support, the government decided to revoke the Chinese Exclusion Act and put an end to it. So in 1943, the Chinese were officially welcomed back into the United States. And this is something that we are used to, having grown up in a very diverse country. We know that there is not one specific group of immigrants that is targeted nowadays or excluded from immigration nowadays. The immigrants in America faced many challenges when they first arrived. It was difficult, it was scary. Jane Addams was a woman who came up with a plan to help aid in the transition for immigrants living in Chicago. Because of this, she's considered our nation's first social worker. Large numbers of immigrants arrived to work in this newly industrialized society. As we've learned previously, ghettos were part of large cities where groups of immigrants lived. In these neighborhoods, immigrants experienced isolation. They felt alone and like they had no help. They faced new customs and social change. It was intimidating to learn American culture and to change your way of life. And they had difficulty understanding and speaking the language. So as a solution, Jane Addams creates a thing called a settlement house. Settlement houses were created to help poor immigrants. They offered improved housing conditions, job training to help people find work. They offered classes to improve reading and writing in English, and they also provided access to medical assistance. These settlement houses also established playgrounds for children, daycare centers, and kindergartners to help the families in the ghetto. They supported labor unions, worked against child labor, and fought against corrupt politicians. As we know, those political machines were taking advantage of new immigrants. Jane Addams was hoping to help them stand up against political machines. A settlement house is just a place where immigrants could go to receive assistance with job training, child care, and medical needs. Here are some pictures of an average settlement house, and this one actually happens to be on the playground of Jane Addams' settlement house, known as the Hull House, because you can see Jane here. And basically the settlement house was a place that could attend to most of the needs of immigrants. Let's say an immigrant had to go on a job interview and needed their children to be watched, so they would drop their children off at the settlement house. Or when they came home from work at night and needed to learn a little of the English language, they could take language classes. If they did not have access to insurance and access to see a doctor when it was needed, these settlement houses provided a way to tend to medical needs as well. A couple of things that you should remember about Jane Addams. Jane came from an upper middle class family. She was college educated. And that's important to know because Jane Addams was not poor herself. She actually came from a pretty wealthy family and was just someone who was so kind-hearted and wanted to reach out to help the struggling immigrants. Jane established the first settlement house in America. It's called the Hull House, H-U-L-L, Hull House. She worked to help immigrants living in the tenements of Chicago, Illinois. So Jane grew up in Chicago, but she was so successful with the Hull House that over time, settlement houses began to open up all over the country in major cities. So she kind of set the path for other settlement houses in America. Here's a picture of the very famous Hull House settlement in Chicago. The This was the first settlement house in the country, and there would be many others to follow. Jane Addams and her friends at the settlement house helped immigrants to attend to their needs, to find jobs, housing, childcare, and basically to learn the culture in America to make that transition easier. In effect, this helped assimilate the new immigrants. Assimilation is the process through which immigrants become part of American culture. So as I mentioned before, the nativists were unwelcoming to immigrants because they came speaking different language, wearing different clothing, listening to different music, eating different food. Just all of their tastes and culture was very different. So Jane Addams helps to teach them the American culture and helps them through the process of assimilation. When you think of this word, there's actually a smaller word hidden inside that can help you to memorize what it means. So when you think of assimilation, I want you to think of it's when immigrants become similar to Americans. Assimilation and similar. As we had mentioned in class, as families came over together, usually the youngest family members would be the first to assimilate and become Americanized. And that's because they go to school and they are exposed to the English language. They're exposed to the culture through their new friends and their classmates. So usually the younger you are, you're less rooted in your home culture and you're quicker to change. You're more influential. Going to school definitely helps new immigrants to assimilate and to take on the American culture quickest.